In Victorian England, a young African woman plotted her revenge with meticulous precision. Once a princess, she had been stolen from her homeland and paraded as Queen Victoria's goddaughter. Years of humiliation and abuse had shaped her into a cunning force, ready to strike back at those who wronged her. On June 27, 1862, in Rochester, England, Mr. Bellamy, a disgraced former editor of the Illustrated London News, sat alone in his lavish home. His wife was away in Yorkshire, and his drinking had already reached excess. Bellamy, with his balding head and lecherous eyes, welcomed the arrival of his unexpected guest. The young woman, dressed impeccably, greeted him with a smile, concealing the storm of emotions brewing within her. "Dance, Sally, dance," he slurred, holding out his hand. His breath reeked of whiskey, and his pudgy fingers trembled with anticipation. He had waited years for this moment, convinced she had finally succumbed to his charms. Obliging his demand, she stepped closer, her movements graceful yet calculated. The floral wallpaper bore witness to their dance, as the portrait of his wife loomed above them, glaring silently. Bellamy's drunkenness made him pliable, and she knew how to play her role to perfection. She coaxed him into drinking more, feigning interest in his stories. "Tell me again about the Duke of York's Tower," she said, pouring another glass of whiskey. Bellamy chuckled, his focus blurred by alcohol and lust. "Perhaps you'd prefer to hear it in my chambers," he suggested, his free hand wandering where it shouldn't. Her stomach churned, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she led him upstairs, her expression betraying nothing. At the top of the staircase, her foot swept out swiftly and silently. Bellamy's balance wavered, and gravity did the rest. His body tumbled down the wooden steps, each impact echoing through the empty house. By the time he hit the ground, his neck had twisted with a sickening crunch. His lifeless form lay crumpled, his trousers unfastened, surrounded by empty bottles. The scene was perfect. It would be ruled an accident, a drunken fall by a disgraced editor whose wife wasn't home to stop him. She stared at his body, her chest heaving as she wrestled with the memories of his advances over the years. His whispered words at social events, his lecherous gaze, the unwanted touches, all of it had led to this moment. He had sought to defile her, and now his own corpse lay exposed, a grotesque mirror of his desires. Outside, the sound of an approaching carriage broke the silence. From behind a tree, she watched as George Reynolds, editor of Reynolds' weekly newspaper, stepped out, clutching a letter. "The gate's open," his assistant noted. The letter had promised a story of scandal, and they had come eager to uncover it. Reynolds and his assistant entered the house, discovering Bellamy's body just as she had planned. The sight would be enough to fill their next edition with sensational headlines, tarnishing Bellamy's name and dealing a blow to the Illustrated London News. A destroyed reputation was far worse than death for the British elite, and she intended to exploit this fear to its fullest. In her carriage on the way home, she turned a playing card in her fingers, the Queen of Spades. She had considered leaving it as her signature but decided against it. Her work was just beginning, and she had no intention of being caught so soon. Her enemy's underestimation of her had always been her greatest weapon. A wrong, she knew, was unredressed if the avenger failed to make herself known to those who had caused it. Bellamy's death was not the culmination of her plan but a step toward a greater goal, dismantling the power structures that had stolen her life. She had studied her targets well, each with their own vulnerabilities, each complicit in her suffering. The chessboard was set, and the game had begun. The British elite, with their fragile egos and hypocritical morals, feared public disgrace more than anything. She would ensure they tasted it in full. As the carriage rattled toward London, she tucked the Queen of Spades away, a symbol of her resolve. The storm she had unleashed was only beginning, and her next move awaited. On a chilly November night in 1850, Omoba Ina, a young Yoruba princess from the Egbodo clan, experienced a life-altering moment. Recently abducted and taken to England, Ina stood barefoot and terrified in a noblewoman's garish drawing room, surrounded by 6 strangers whose hollow eyes and cruel smiles marked them as enemies. These British elites, including Captain Frederick Forbes of the Royal Navy, her captor and self-proclaimed savior, scrutinized her with condescension and objectification. The noblewoman, preoccupied with flaunting her wealth, tapped her antique French fan and openly discussed Ina's physical features. Comparing her to the Hottentot Venus, a South African woman historically exploited and dehumanized, the woman dismissed Ina as a mere curiosity. Captain Forbes and his accomplice, George Forbes, boasted about saving Ina from King Gezo of the Dahomey Kingdom, reducing her cultural heritage and personal tragedy to a pawn in their diplomatic games. As they spoke, Ina's young mind raced to make sense of their venomous words and grotesque behavior. The drawing room's mismatched French decor and blood-red couches reflected the oppressive atmosphere. Ina felt trapped, her escape blocked both physically by the furniture and existentially by the overwhelming power of her captors. At just 7 years old, she understood the precariousness of her situation. Their treatment of her confirmed her mother's warnings about iseku, evil spirits, though she realized these were not mythical demons but British oppressors. The gathering devolved into mockery and cruelty. The group measured Ina's skull with instruments meant for animals, drawing blood and tears. They debated her worth based on pseudoscientific racial theories, demeaning her intelligence and objectifying her body. The hawk-like noblewoman suggested stripping Ina to compare her physique to the Hottentot Venus, further dehumanizing her. When Mr. Bellamy, one of the men, remarked on Ina's shapely buttocks, with thinly veiled lust, her fear deepened. Despite her terror, Ina refused to dance for them at first, asserting her dignity in silence. But under their relentless demands, she ultimately complied, her body trembling as she moved. That night, Ina fully grasped the nature of her new world. She was a prisoner, stripped of agency and viewed as a tool for propaganda. Her captors, Captain Forbes, his brother George, the Scotsman McCoskrie, Bellamy, the photographer Bambridge, and the hawk-like noblewoman, had no regard for her humanity. Each regarded her as an exotic object to be molded and showcased, a living testament to Britain's supposed moral superiority. The next morning, Ina was presented to Queen Victoria in the grandeur of Windsor Castle. The vast marble hall, adorned with velvet and gold, symbolized the imperial power of Britain. Standing before the Queen, Ina felt the weight of her ancestors' legacy and the fire of her parents' unyielding spirit. But the Queen's gaze, filled with pity and condescension, only deepened her anger. Captain Forbes introduced Ina to Queen Victoria, referring to her by the name he had imposed, Sarah Forbes Bonetta. The name erased Ina's identity and heritage, replacing it with a title meant to symbolize Britain's civilizing mission. Queen Victoria, with a calculated smile, declared Ina her new goddaughter and announced plans to publicize her as Britain's African princess. In that moment, Ina recognized the Queen as the seventh and most dangerous villain in her life. Unlike the others, whose cruelty was overt, the Queen's malice was veiled in benevolence. Victoria saw Ina not as a child or a person but as a symbol to validate British colonialism. Declaring Britain the moral fabric of the world, the Queen framed Ina's rescue as proof of Britain's superiority. Her touch, meant to appear nurturing, felt to Ina like the cold hand of domination. Ina's anger simmered as the Queen mused about molding her into a lady and a showcase for British compassion. This transformation, however, hinged on Ina's ability to conform to their standards, erasing her true self. She thought of Aid, her only friend, who had been deemed unworthy by the same standards and discarded overboard during their voyage to England. Aid's death was a stark reminder that British love was conditional and that failure to meet their expectations meant destruction. As Queen Victoria announced plans to spread Ina's story across newspapers, branding her as a symbol of British kindness, Ina's resolve hardened. She recognized the irony of the Queen's rhetoric. While Britain's empire prided itself on civility, its actions, enslavement, exploitation, and murder, revealed its true nature. The Queen's condescension, masked as care, embodied the empire's hypocrisy. Ina's identity as Omoba Ina, a Yoruba princess, clashed with her imposed role as Sarah Forbes Bonetta. This internal conflict fueled her determination to resist, even silently. She refused to forget who she was or where she came from. The memory of her parents, their strength in the face of death, and Aid's final words, "Their love for you is conditional, Ina. Never forget that," remained her guiding truths. This encounter with Queen Victoria marked the beginning of Ina's life in England, a life defined by contradiction and resistance. She was simultaneously exalted and dehumanized, used as both a symbol of British benevolence and a tool for imperial propaganda. Yet, in her heart, Ina carried the fire of her heritage and the knowledge that her worth extended far beyond the conditional approval of her captors. She resolved to survive, not as their puppet but as a living testament to the resilience of her people. Sarah Forbes Bonetta, Queen Victoria's African goddaughter, prepares for the royal wedding of Princess Alice and Prince Louis IV in 1862. Traveling in a grand carriage sent by the Queen, Sarah's appearance draws envy and curiosity in her genteel Canterbury neighborhood. To the British, she is both a novelty and a token of imperial benevolence, her life defined by her dramatic rescue as a child from sacrifice and her role as a civilized African in high society. Despite outward smiles, Sarah is acutely aware of her precarious position as a celebrated yet marginalized figure. On her journey, Sarah detours to London to collect Sybil Vale, a young woman desperate to reignite her romance with Sarah's uncle, George Forbes. Sarah, calculating and pragmatic, manipulates Sybil into believing she can win George's affections if she follows Sarah's plan. Sybil, naive and consumed by her Cinderella fantasies, reluctantly agrees. Sarah supplies her with a lavender dress, alluring perfume, and a narrative designed to prey on her romantic ideals. George's desire, not love, is what Sarah relies on to push forward her hidden agenda. The two women travel to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, the royal family's summer home, where the wedding is to take place. As they approach, Sybil marvels at the estate's splendor, while Sarah remains composed, accustomed to royal opulence and the subtle dangers of such gatherings. For Sarah, every social event is a high-stakes performance where one misstep could lead to social ruin. Upon entering, the celebratory atmosphere expected of a royal wedding is replaced with somber tones. Guests weep, their red eyes revealing a lingering grief over the recent death of Prince Albert. The wedding has become a strange fusion of joy and mourning, underscoring the shadow cast by loss even amidst the grandeur. Sarah, ever poised, reassures Sybil to act natural, though she herself feels the weight of expectations. Beneath her composed exterior, she wrestles with the contradictions of her life. As the Queen's colonial jewel, she is both an honored guest and a symbol of empire, her existence shaped by the Crown's narrative of mercy and civilization. Sarah's sharp wit and survival instincts guide her through this labyrinth of power and privilege. She understands that her place in this world hinges on playing her role convincingly, even as she harbors a deep awareness of its hypocrisies. Through her relationship with Sybil, she demonstrates her ability to navigate social dynamics with precision, using others' desires and insecurities to her advantage. The story captures Sarah's duality, a young woman navigating the veneer of Victorian high society while grappling with the internal and external forces that define her. It is a tale of identity, agency, and survival in a world that alternately reveres and confines her, where every action is a calculated step in a game of appearances and alliances.